Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. Welcome to part two of this deep dive into Nokia and the 2016 paper by our guests, Hui and Timo Vuori. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's great to have you back. I'm going to give a little bit of context. So it's 2007. The game has switched from hardware to software. And don't forget, Nokia, 1 billion customers. Can anyone catch the cell phone king? That was the front cover of a Forbes article featuring the CEO at the time, Nokia, who had pulled away, owning half the market share of the mobile phone industry. But at this stage, Apple and Google had moved fast. Don't forget, they had built operating systems all the time, and now all of a sudden they were just going to do it on a different device, a different form factor. Samsung had adopted Android, and Nokia had doubled down on Symbian and MeeGo, even as consumers turned against them. What was happening inside Nokia that made the company cling to a losing path? That is what our authors today reveal. I read through this research many times and looked at the methods and pulled out a few lines that were telling, and I'd love you to comment on these. In your interviews, top managers told you they pressurized middle managers for faster performance, and middle managers in turn told you how they felt pressured by the top managers. You say several middle managers shared additional examples of how they felt fear or how fear had prevented them from reporting negative information up to the top, even though they knew it would have been the right thing to do. And in your findings, you write, various types of fear experienced by Nokia's top managers and middle managers caused a decoupling interaction pattern between two groups that harmed Nokia's innovation process. Two factors influenced top managers and middle managers' fears. Nokia's structural distribution of attention produced differences in appraisals and shared fears among top and middle managers. And top managers' past aggressive behaviors and widely shared stories about those past aggressive behaviors triggered intuitive fear reactions in middle managers because they had a lower position in the organizational hierarchy. So let's share how the organizational structure and where people focus their attention caused this fear and how it spread across the entire organization.
In Nokia's structure, the top management had a rather good view of the competition, and they had their internal strategy team consisting of 200 strategy experts and market intelligence experts and external consultants. So the top management was very aware of the customer demand in terms of what the mobile operators wanted. And they felt a lot of pressure from the iPhone and Android, even though they weren't able to say it out loud. So top management had external focus, a lot of fear, and even small panic about the external threats. But internally, the middle management in software development was quite disconnected from the customer interface. So from middle manager's point of view, the things were going fine, but top management suddenly started giving them stronger and stronger pressure and more demands, and middle management couldn't understand where this is coming from. So instead of fearing the iPhone, they feared the top management because they felt that the requests from top management are unrealistic but irrelevant. So the logical way out from this is to lie to them or mislead them.
I would like to elaborate what Timo just said, because when we explain that case, some executives ask us, so why don't top managers tell middle managers the truth, to tell them that they know the plans by the iPhone, that the real threat, so that they can get the reality. So therefore, they become less complacent. But that is the practical reality of organizations. They know the secret, but they could not tell the secret to middle managers because it will be leaked. And then the competitors will change their plans. So that's point number one. Point number two is that if they said that they are concerned about the Apple threat, how would investors react? They said that are they going to lose market share? Are they expressing some type of weaknesses? So top managers, in a way, we can understand them. There are some kind of dilemma. They have to keep the secret. They cannot tell to middle managers everything they knew. And at the same time, middle managers feel quite powerful because they said, where is the threat? Even if something come up, we have most of the patents. We possess most of the technical patents that Samsung and Apple have been using or will be using. So we have absolute technical superiority. So that's explains also why they feel a little bit, they don't feel to fear as much as they should have.
Third point why top management felt they cannot openly communicate it, the threat was really about this sustaining the morale. So the top management, I think, mistakenly believed that if they speak about the threat, it will destroy the motivation inside the organization. But with the caveat that Kui mentioned about the kind of external responses. So if you say as a leader that our products are inferior, of course the external reaction is negative. But even more fundamentally related to the distribution of attention is that top management didn't necessarily understand how different perception of the external competition they had compared to the middle management. So top management would see these McKinsey reports about the iPhone and its future prospects, while middle management, they would only buy competitors' phones from the store and compare what they were developing against the old products from competition. So the middle managers also lived in a different reality without top managers fully realizing that.
One of the things you say there is really interesting. So this wasn't just about the hardware, which was the phones, but it was also about the software. So Symbian, and maybe we'll elaborate a little bit on what that is, the Symbian operating system. But one of the things from the interviews that you took was one of the top managers you interviewed was saying, why did you not call out how inadequate Symbian was? And to your point about they didn't want to damage morale. He said, when this is the only weapon, you have to believe in that gun, even though the gun might be inadequate because you don't want to reveal it and go, we're going to war here with pea shooters when the others have dramatically advanced technology. Maybe we'll elaborate a little bit on that difference.
Yeah, that was, I think, the most fascinating paradox or dilemma in the study, that the CEO knew that Symbian was inadequate, but he felt that he cannot speak about its problems because they didn't have options to Symbian. But then, because he didn't bring it up, no one dared to bring it up. And so they didn't develop those options. And they got stuck in this collective denial of not addressing the elephant in the room.
Kui, I thought I'd bring you in because one of the things we talked about on air was I want our audience to realize this. It's easy to look at the Nokia story and kind of go, oh, idiots, I can't believe they've done that. But this is a template that plays out in every organization. And I mean here organizations such as governments even, where people are afraid of telling the truth because of the repercussions. One of the examples, for example, you give in here is that a very senior software developer didn't report the truth because he said, look, I should have had more courage. Because you interviewed them afterwards and they're going, why didn't you speak up? And he's like, I should have had more courage. It was a collective lie. But also I had young children and I needed to keep my job because Nokia was like the gold standard job in Finland.
And also, most people tend to say that if we need one or two whistleblower, that would have fixed this situation, right? But like in the case of Boeing, or the case that we later on, or the disasters, or in the case of Volkswagen Dieselgate, they said, what happens if we have two or three whistleblowers, right? But in the case of Nokia, two or three whistleblowers might not have worked for the following reasons, right? A is that top managers, as the Timo just said, we have to listen to the majority. And the majority of senior executives told us that we can do it. They will give us the good news, so we can do it. There's always a minority of naysayers, no matter what you do. And those whistle players are naysayers. So whom should we trust? So that is a real dilemma in organization. And back to the point that Timo just said, when you go to war, you have to display optimism. So you cannot let a few naysayers bring down the morale of the whole troops. You cannot win. So even if there were a few whistleblowers, it might not have worked. So it's not as easy as people might have thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true, and they really had kind of options to choose from, the senior leaders. But I think we should be understanding and empathic also toward the senior leaders, that they were not necessarily naive, but they were under huge pressure. Nokia was like one of the top brands in the world and really dominating company, and suddenly huge threats. They were personally under major pressure, so that made it more difficult for them to evaluate the situation objectively. And then there was a lot of uncertainty. So in retrospect, we know that Symbian failed. But when you had multiple people coming to you that, hey, we can make it work. And look, we did a successful phone last year. So this one will also succeed. It's difficult not to believe that. And then there's a handful of naysayers. You want to believe that they are wrong.
And to elaborate on Timo's point, we met and interviewed Odipeka Craspio, which on YouTube you may want to listen to it. And then when a senior executives showing this videotape, and one of their first reaction, what a stupid guy, what an incompetent guy. How can he become the CEO of Nokia like this? And I caution these people not to judge with the hindsight of history. That if you put yourself under the fog of the war, after all, he is as famous as Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Jesse Huang today. And people will say that he's fantastic. Let's not forget, he was elected as the number one CEO of the world by fellow CEOs back in 2008 to 2009. Number one in strategic agility, showcase for the world in strategic agility. And now you say this is stupid. So let's not make the mistake of judging people via the hindsight of history, and be empathic with the person and senior management team. So it's not the judgment of their incompetence, but more a lesson for us of humility. That as leaders, you have to be very humble.
And today, thinking about companies making AI investments. So let's take an insurance company. You have your traditional business model and you're making huge profit. Then you have AI coming in and people saying then that in a couple of years AI is going to destroy your business. There will be new companies, new processes. So do you invest in developing the traditional model where you have for the past 10 years always made profit from your investments, or do you put all in into AI and hope for the best without knowing what will happen?
Especially with the current data and AI today, to put things in perspective, the data reveals that 90% or more of the companies invest in AI did not make a cent. That is the fact. So should you invest more and more to bank for the future, or do less and keep the current business? So I think it's the same type of uncertainty about innovation that all executives and companies face. And then I think we have to be more humble and have more emotional empathy to really see the full picture.
I spoke with the market intelligence people, and they were the ones who got the information from the corporate spies or wherever. And they really had this detailed report, and it was exactly like you said. The day that iPhone was introduced, Nokia shared internally this extremely detailed analysis. So they had full understanding of what it's like and what it's going to be in future, where it can evolve. But I think there was two kind of emotional dynamics that even if people saw the slides and heard that it has a touch screen and you can pinch and squeeze and download apps, they didn't feel the pressure that it was easy to say in Finland, for instance, that the touchscreen will freeze in the winter, so no one wants to use it, and no one wants to type with touchscreen, and so there was this emotional denial in that sense. And the second part was, I think many of them believe that it's easier to build a competing product. And in two senses, so from a technological and usability point, how difficult it is to create this extremely smooth product. But also from middle management point of view, it was challenging that they had a plan how to build a new version of the Symbian operating system that would support the touchscreen technology in the best possible way. But the top management ended up sabotaging the development with short-term pressures and cost pressures. So one example was that the cutting-edge touchscreen would have required a bit more expensive memory chip, but top management decided that let's take the less expensive one, so we make more profit from this model. And then they had to compromise on some features. And then another element was that when they changed the launch schedule and different products, they had to compromise on the cumulative development of the software platform to get the product out earlier. But that didn't only make the launch product worse, but all the subsequent products also. This also made the development ever more difficult. So it's both the understanding of how good the competition is, that was emotionally difficult to accept. And then there was this double level overconfidence in own ability and top management ability to lead the development. So you have multiple uncertainties and you want to win, you end up believing all the optimistic versions.
I think together, all the groups have all the elements and all the technologies necessary to do anything they want, right? At the elemental level. But at the dialogue level, at the consensus coordination level, it was very weak because everybody has the piece, but nobody shared the whole element. So nobody has the full picture, right? So people are working on part of the middle managers are working on part of the what they understood. They got from top managers. That's what I call the focus attention. The attention was there, but it was partial and limited. And so are top managers. They could have the whole picture, but they chose not to for whatever of the structural incentive reasons. So they have to work with the partial reality. And those two partial realities just clash.
In that one, the culture of fear really complicated matters because you remember the example they told how there was a meeting in front of top management, kind of several teams were presenting at top management at the same time. And the first team knew that they are going to be late in their part of the work and that probably all other groups are also going to be late on their part. But no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. So everyone pretended that things are on track and we're waiting for the others to say it out first, like playing the game of chicken that who will yield first. And then it ended up in a crash because no one did. But if they had this more open or less fearful culture, they could have in these moments do this coordination that we mentioned, that they could have said that, okay, we are delayed because of these things and put all the pieces together. But this top management wasn't able to give this space for reflection because they felt their own pressure that we need to deliver that. We need to get the results for this quarter and we need to innovate faster. So don't give me problems. Just tell me it's going to work. sales and strategy and business and strong kind of experience in the traditional radio technology. There were some people with PhD in the top management as well in at least partially relevant areas, but some of the top managers just didn't have the kind of in-depth knowledge of understanding that. And some of the rumors were like that when some top manager got a new Nokia phone, the assistant would configure the email because he wasn't able to do it. So I don't know if that was like really true, but in another book there was an example of a board meeting where one of the board members' phone started ringing and he didn't know how to switch off the sound. When those are extreme examples, but it really about this ability to challenge the employees on the technical aspects. But Nokia had never been a kind of only a technology company, but a conglomerate with multiple different businesses. It divested everything else and focused on the phones, but the kind of management style remained from that era.
I wish to come the defense of Nokia senior executives in the following sense. It may be impractical to expect top managers of a large organization to be technically highly competent in their products. And in their defense, I use the case of, let's say, that people always compare OPK Carlos to Steve Jobs, because Steve Jobs apparently he had a very deep understanding, at least from technical side, what can be done and what cannot be done. Unlike Olipeka View or Nokia senior managers. But then I said, compare them against the senior managers of large pharmaceutical firms. Think of Pfizer, AstraZeneca. Would you expect those CEOs to understand all the biomedical devices, all the outcomes of 100,000 research products that they are making? There are tens of thousands of PhDs working on different pharmaceutical products and drugs treatments. Would you expect the CEO to understand any of those, let alone all of those, right? So it's not practical. So I think if you're developing a single product, then maybe it could be expected or maybe not. But if you're developing a lot of products, it's very difficult to expect the CEO to have a deep technical expertise on his products, because none of the scientists working in the organization would have even truck expertise. So that's my defense of Silk CEO.
I agree with you here in the sense that it's not possible to have deep expertise on all technologies. And I guess in Nokia's case, it was that they had been able to trust the radio engineers for 20 years. So they had learned that what they say is the truth. But when the technology moved to software and they hired a lot of new people, the same kind of reliability of the knowledge was no longer there. So it would have required a bit different type of leadership. And I don't think it's always that you need to be inside the technology, but you need to have this sufficiently critical and curious attitude that how does it really work, and does, like now when we're taking an AI angle, so all the CEOs hear pitches about AI and how it's gonna replace something, but they shouldn't naively believe that, okay, I trust you, that let's go, but really double check that, okay, how it will replace the pros, and what if this happens, what will happen. And maybe there is this kind of curiosity, but even without deep technological expertise.
I just thought this was so important to say on this, that it, and I'll come back to a couple of things to build out this, because there's so much depth in this paper that you can see from doing 2 shows, we still won't get through it all. But you talked about innovation underperformance at Nokia. As a result, they had an over-optimistic capability perception. They thought they were better than they were. And this makes sense because you said that this had come from historically being the case inside Nokia. But at Nokia, pressure to introduce new phone models in the short term deprived the Symbian unit, so that's the software for those who don't know, of the time they needed to make the OS more modular. And I wanted to point this out because this is the template that Kui talked about before. This is what happens everywhere. I suffered myself this, where you're talking to a leadership team or a board in some case who have no idea what's needed to create technology. For those people who worked in digital, say, for example, in the late noughties, early 2010s, for example, building applications, building websites, that somebody looking at it thinks it's just a picture and all you have to do is move that picture over there and it's just like designing a picture. But you have to keep dropping innovative work, and no one cares about that because they don't get rewarded for that exploration. And Nokia top managers, they had no idea of what it took to change an operating system or even to build apps, to build up that app store enough to get people to use those new smartphones. And in Nokia's context, you say here, another problem, another element of the problem was Nokia's structural arrangements did not prevent product units' immediate needs from overwhelming the long-term needs of Symbian software. And in ambidextrous organizations, which many of our audience are familiar with, this idea of exploit and explore, the unit focusing on long-term development should not have short-term pressures. That's an absolutely key point here is keep delivering the phones, keep delivering the phones. And meanwhile, whatever scraps of time you have, deliver this massive project, which is a whole new software.
This was the fundamental problem, and I think in all the interviews that was the most puzzling things, because everyone was describing some version of this problem, that the long-term development was constantly compromised by the short-term pressure. So why you didn't separate it, or why you didn't report it, and that led to the fear recognition and then the financial pressures, and ultimately they did separate it, but then it was too late. And what they emphasized, and what Kui also mentioned, that the structural separation doesn't always work when you have a very integrated product line. So if they have completely separated Symbian, what would they have sold during those 1 or 2 years that it takes to develop the new version of the software? In retrospect, probably they would now be selling phones still, but in the fog of war, that would be a very bad decision.
Kui, can I bring you in there? Because you said that off air when we were talking off air, you said about this idea that, and this is often the challenge between, say, the Clayton Christensen school of thought was like, you need to get it away from the sucking sound of the core, get away your innovation team, versus Tushman and O'Reilly is like, no, you need to integrate it because you need it to be accepted and not rejected, like some type of organizational bad liver transplant. So I'd love you to elaborate on that because it's a key point.
Yeah, because today, as you mentioned, Aidan, one of the kind of solutions that people propose to deal with the tension with the short and long term is about the issue of structural separation. Structural separation means that you have one unit that focus on the short-term exploitation of current business, and another long-term, which is essentially R&D that develop for the long-term and focus on innovation. Now, my research later suggests that it's not as easy as people will make to say. One is that the long-term structural units tend to be the envy and attack of the short-term units, who said that we are the ones who have to make the sales and make the money for you guys to engage in some kind of fluffy R&D, which you never see. What are you guys developing? We never sure what you are developing. You guys are consuming a whole lot of money that we have painfully earned, and you know what it takes. So that is the butt of envy, what they call the notion of inter-user envy. And that's and envy is not just, it doesn't stop there, right? It results in all kinds of bad saying, lack of cooperation, so forth. So I have, for example, I met I don't want to mention the industry, but some high-tech people who are in the long term, who wants to develop some prototype, and now they want to go and test it in the big banks and the financial industries. But the short-term units who are dealing with the banks will not allow them to do that. They said, because what happens if your product doesn't work? We will be jeopardizing our relationship with our customers, with the banks. We cannot afford that, because you guys are doing R&D, which you're not aware of, and we cannot open the doors for you. So that is a real tension between in the same organization, between the short-term sales unit and marketing and the long-term engineers and R&D. Right? So that's only one example. The other example is even if the product works. Now, I think you wish to reintegrate the working product inside the model organization because make it into a core product, right? In order to scale it up. Because once you have the prototype that works, you have to bring back to the core organization to scale it up. And now the organization who had never anything to do with it did not feel the pride of ownership. They said, why should we take an orphan from somewhere to integrate you? It's like you're bringing an immigrant, a landed immigrant from somewhere, which we never accepted anyway. And look at all the issue we have with migrant today. He said, why are we accepting some foreigners or foreign products into our country? It doesn't fit our culture. So all this anti-cultural, anti-stuff, very similar to the migrant, anti-migrant narrative would surface. And people would do anything to sabotage, to show that it doesn't work. So that's from my real research. I could see it happens so many times. It's not even funny. So yes, on the paper it looks good. In practice, it's much more challenging than you think. And those are emotional driven, right?
And it's also frustrating for the innovator. So I worked in a team like that, and you get integrated and they butcher your ideas. They try and that term again, Clayton Christensen used, cramming. They try and cram your idea into an existing solution that just doesn't work for it, like we're seeing with AI today. But speaking of Clayton Christensen, I was looking on the shelf there for the book. On the jacket, inside the cover jacket in the endorsements of Clayton Christensen's and Michael Rayner's 2003 book, The Innovation Solution, is an endorsement, and it says, the authors have done a superb job of creating a framework for helping to understand industry dynamics and for planning your own growth alternatives. And that comment was written in 2003 by Pekka Alla Pietila. Timo, I'm probably butchering his name there. But from 1999 2005, Pietila was the president of Nokia. And to your point, it doesn't mean that he was a bad president. It doesn't mean that he's a bad CEO or anything like that. But it's so difficult to read the label when you're inside the jar. When it's you who are the victim of disruption, it's so hard to see that. But I want to tie it to something else that's really important here. The history of aggression inside Nokia, because we hear this from the outside in other organizations. Say, for example, Microsoft pre-Satya Nadella, very much dog-eat-dog culture. And you say a second factor that triggered fear among Nokia's middle managers was its top managers' history of aggressive behaviors towards those middle managers, which was widely known inside the organization. And when conducting your interviews, you were struck how often informants referred to the aggressive behavior of Nokia's top chairman, who was also CEO from 1992 to 2006, and he was described as extremely temperamental, shouting at people at the top of his lungs so hard that it was very difficult to tell him things that he did not want to hear. And those same informants described several other top managers as highly aggressive. And one of the EVPs told you about how he pounded the table so hard that pieces of fruit went flying everywhere. And that same EVP had nothing but poison running through his veins. So those type of characters used to do well. That whole idea of Gordon Gekko in Wall Street, greed is good. While we hope it's gone, and we talked about this off air, that we hope younger generations are changing that culture, it still has echoes in many organizations today.
Yeah, that's true. And I think there are at least three angles to that. One is that it was those aggressive behaviors, but especially the stories about the aggression. So the individuals, they were like most of the time very nice people. But then there were these moments where they exploded and those stories spread really widely in the organization, and that generated even this like unrealistic or completely irrational fear. And even the new CEO, who wasn't one of the aggressive people, he told how whenever he goes to the lunchroom, everyone is watching for his every expression, that if his mouth twitches a bit, there is immediately huge rumors about what's happening. So as a CEO or top leader, it's huge impact. Then the second part is the huge pressure that they are under. So when if you don't take care of yourself and manage your own stress and all this, then you easily misbehave, even if you are a good person. And then third, the young generation, at least in Finland, and we've been lucky in the sense that we have a lot of open discussion about the emotions in management, and it feels that the younger generation is able to reflect on the emotions and accepts that it's part of the leadership style. And obviously, since they're all doing cognitive work, they also feel the impact more strongly.
I would like to add to what Timo just said as a reflection, right? And I can see today, even Nokia was 10 years ago now, but it's almost as if it just repeats itself every day today in the following sense. There is a seeming paradox in society and in organizations. On one hand, people said we have to be nice to each other, more civil, more inclusive, more respectful, right? So that is the narrative. But there is an emergent narrative that says that you cannot make omelette without putting eggs. And sometimes to make changes, you have to be tough. So there is a very high cult of dictators, either in nations, which I don't want to get into politics, which we can talk about without getting that one, and celebration of dictators in organizations. And although the stock market, on one hand, they say they like to have inclusion and respect. On the other hand, they seem to reward equally well those dictators and those rough, and those uncivil people, right? So no wonder, maybe that's why 40% of young people to 30, 40 cop out. They say, I can't handle this bubble talk because working in organization was too tough. And in the end, we say one thing, but we reward the dictatorship and the rough people. So I just want to say, if the Nokia story just presents us with the same paradox and the same tensions that we have in today's society and in organizations.
That actually reminds me of Kui's 2002 paper on emotional balancing, that people need both when you are in change moment, you need both kind of validation and empathy, and you need direction. And Kui found that in best units, you have middle managers who provide the kind of empathy and others who push the change. But what I think is behind this paradox now is that some people are really frustrated about the lack of progress and being very careful about not insulting anyone. And then the counter reaction is that let's have someone who just tells everyone what to do and we get something done type of thing. So finding the balance between kind of hearing, listening on the one hand, and then like driving progress on the other, it's not easy.
Yeah, and then we have that reflect society. Now we have so-called extreme left and extreme right. Each has their own echo chambers, and all that we are right. So I think that kind of conflict in society and in politics also I reflect in organization in this other way.
That's a key point. As a leadership team, it's not just what you reward or recognize, it's also what you reprimand when you stand up against behaviors that you don't want in the organization. And as you said, this has not gone away. Even from my own perspective, I worked in an organization where I started the innovation show, and I essentially had to leave that organization to keep it because they were like going, we don't want you doing those type of things. And in other organizations, there were bullies, and those bullies did well in the organization because while the organization said they didn't want those behaviors, those people got results, but they got results at huge costs to people's health, mental health. And the second order and third order effects of that, where those people aren't present for their children, maybe they're pressurized at home, maybe they're sick. There's so much that goes on behind this, which is why I think this paper is so important. Speaking of which, I thought about one of the important things in this paper. You said about the fact that there was constant change inside Nokia. And I found that reflection really important because I know places like, we mentioned Satya Nadella and Microsoft, and the book title, his book, Hit Refresh. And inside Microsoft, by all accounts, it's a little bit like, when you're trying to get an elevator door to close and you're in a rush and you start hitting the button over and over. It's hit refresh to that extent where it's constantly going and it's exhausting for people, because there also must be so much waste, because they might be working on an initiative. Next thing, they're assigned to a different team or have a different team to put together, and they lose all the progress that they've made. It's like being a politician and then there's a change of government. But you wrote of Nokia's tendency to change its organizational structure frequently to ensure effective resource allocation made middle managers and product unit managers and the software organizations perceive heightened threats to their well-being inside the organization and low ability to cope with such uncertainty. And reorganizations, this is a quote from a manager, were difficult. People had to reapply for their jobs at Nokia. I sent my application. This is this middle manager speaking. Then you got an invitation to an interview, and it was quite tough, he said. At that point, you started to wonder whether you were working at Nokia or not. And I felt like I wasn't, because I didn't have a job or position. That is such a key point, and I'd love you to elaborate on it.
In theory, they wanted to be dynamic and assumed that people are committed and motivated and behave rationally, but that created a strong short-term incentive to only do stuff that will look good in the next job interview and don't care about any of the risks that happen afterwards. And when it was done in such a huge scale, it really contributed to the tendency to fear about telling bad news or flag the long-term risks. And it's Nokia had this strategic agility idea that constant change is what keeps you going. And I agree on the theory, but there is this human element that wasn't resolved.
And I think the management theory just swing from one extreme to the other one, in the sense that we have this all cliche statement that we need constant change. And that's what Nokia was about. After all, it held the first place in the world in terms of strategic agility. We remember, I said that, never forget that Nokia was held as the world showcase for strategic agility for 10, 15 years, much as General Electric. Remember, Jack Welch was the business school case for 10 or 15 years in terms of conglomerate, and you have to be number one or number two, or else. And that kind of cliche statement, and that also went around for 15 years with GE, that we have Nokia. And so my point is that strategic agility, constant change, is good for something and bad for other things. Not as now. Constant change is good for incremental innovation. Like in the case of Nokia, once you have a good product, a good paradigm, then you can do all kinds of tweaking, which much like Apple's doing today, by the way. You have iPhone 16, 15, more cameras, more memories, more cameras, a little bit more application, but those are incremental innovation. And you can do a lot of incremental change and fast change this way. But if you have to do a fundamental change, what would be Apple's next radical new product? We have to see. What is it? We don't know yet, right? But that's not something that you can do fast change.
You've actually reminded me of a piece, and this is in the footnotes. This is how in-depth I read your work here, by the way. You have a counterfactual situation where, so we talked about the fear inside Nokia, but also to your point, some of the top managers had high technological competence, but not all. And you say here, consider Steve Jobs' influence on Apple, which seemed to have a somewhat similar, if less extreme, fear profile as Nokia. So by all accounts, Jobs ruled by fear, and he felt high external fear regarding Apple's long-term success. So he was constantly on the hunt for threats to that change. And it was very upset when Google announced Android and worried that it would destroy the iPhone. He even says that in his biography with Walter Isaacson. But he was also notorious for instilling fear among middle managers. And Jobs seemed reasonably in touch with the technology they used in the iPhone, and was closely involved in its development. For example, he spent part of every day for 6 months helping refine the display of the iPhone, according again to that biography, but was extremely demanding about technological quality. I thought that was an important contrast to show to Nokia.
People always ask me about this question to contrast Steve Jobs and the OPK from Nokia. I said, Professor, after all, you said that fear was bad, but Steve Jobs ruled by fear and he was quite successful. So what do you make of it? My answer was that Steve Jobs, in fact, ruled by fear. He was very authoritative, but he had something else which Nokia did not have. And that's from emotional capital theory back to emotional balancing, which Timo was just referring to. He was able to balance fear with thoughtful passion. What I mean by that, he was able to instill thoughtful passion among the engineers. The engineers, because that we are going to develop the most coolest product, the game-changing product. And you know what? You guys, just bring you guys here. I will pay you guys almost anything, everything you need to develop the product. You will have it. It does not matter. Go for excellence. And that's the narrative that most research engineers would love to hear. Said that I could tolerate your harassment, so to speak, quote unquote, as long as you give me all the money I need to fulfill my hobby. The engineers is a hobby, right? So I could hack it. I could handle it. So I think that's my hypothesis. He was able to balance the fear, the pressure with the thoughtful passion that we have to achieve the best, and we give you all the resources to fulfill your passion.
That's a huge distinction in that Jobs had this passion for superior product quality, while Nokia top management, it was more about the financial performance. And that reminds me of the N97 phone, which was Nokia's first supposed iPhone killer. And it was rushed to the market and it had serious bugs. So sometimes you just couldn't answer a phone call with the phone because the software was so glitchy. But Nokia top management debated and decided to launch the product even though they knew it had a lot of bugs because the short-term financial result was more important than the kind of perfect product. I guess Steve Jobs, based on what I've read about him, would have really gotten angry at the engineers and wanted a better product before launching. But then second aspect is how close he was to the product development also physically. Apple's product development happened in the same building where Jobs' office was. But in Finland, the closest R&D center was like 1.5 hour drive away from the headquarters. And when I interviewed the design engineers, they told a story how someone asked them that, how often do you think Steve Jobs visits the designers at Apple? And the Nokia designer was like, well, maybe once a month, once a week. And then the answer was 4 times per day. So the kind of product organization and closeness between management and the product development was just very different. And of course, Apple had just one phone, so Nokia had 20 or 30. So the whole structural setup was different. And the CEO mentioned how Nokia was one of the first truly global companies with development in 60 different countries versus Apple having everything in one campus in California.
There's another thing there. Was that in Tampere? Is that how you say it? The R&D center.
There was Tampere is one.
The reason I say that is you reminded me of a piece from the paper, and we're going to read this out. You said the atmosphere of fear was created also through speech. The worst one was the presentation by the chairman who gave this presentation in Tampere, city in Finland, about R&D expenses. He said that his only mistake had been to give us, this is their R&D people, too much money, and that despite that, our products were still not good enough and we weren't making them fast enough. And on top of that, he said, if things continued as they were, 15% of the people in the seminar hall would be gone by the time he came back next year. And that was this guy, this middle manager's first encounter with the chairman. I thought about that as a contrast to what you just said.
So what is it the case of? So you can think of the case of Steve Jobs and Apple, very tight emotional coupling, emotional engagement with the developers, right? through his behaviors, meeting very often, putting pressure on them, but also taking care of them by giving how much help you need, how much resources, how much money you need. Money is flowing, right? Compared to the older behaviors, which is more threatening and limiting and constraining and decoupling. So you can see that the very different manager approach for innovation, which you can explain part of the success or failure.
I thought one last thing we might touch on was the low external threat. So I have to counter this with the fact that we saw the document that was passed around inside Nokia, and it was extremely detailed, and it predicted the future very accurately about how the market would play out, price wars that would play out, etc., etc. But I did a long-term form series with Gary Hamill for the Innovation Show, and Gary was also a consultant for Nokia, and he worked with them on an early prototype of the mobile phone. But later on, he said, "Guys, you know what? We need to revisit this. I don't think it's going to carry you all the way through the future." And they were like, at this stage, they were all multimillionaires. Like, "Oh, no, we're okay. Thanks a million, Gary. You're just looking for more business." But in your paper, you say here, a senior strategy consultant explained that Nokia's middle managers had little external fear that other firms were better because they believed Nokia had superior capabilities relative to those other organizations. They were overconfident in those abilities. From a consultant's point of view, it showed in how they treated the consultants, whatever function you were in at Nokia. Talk about like, hey, have you thought about this issue? And you say, Nokia has always been one of the most arrogant companies towards colleagues. This is the person, the consultant saying this, who were partners back then. And it showed up in how everything was always perfect. Nokians were the best in class, and they didn't even want to hear how you thought about things differently because they felt that they were inside a cocoon and they were padded in some way from the external view. I thought that was an interesting thing, given the contrast of there were some people who were aware of the competitive threat, but at the same time, there was this internal confidence that was somewhat unfounded.
One of the people who wrote the report that you're mentioning, he said something like that, where the number of people who really knew the pain or felt the pain was way too small. So it was this market intelligence unit where they really analyzed the iPhone that felt the pain. And even some of them said that they only truly felt it after they started using the iPhone. So even after writing the report, they didn't fully believe it emotionally. But then people working in R&D or other areas in middle management where they were mainly looking at their own products and benchmarking them against Ericsson and Sony and other products and seeing how they do better, they just didn't see the difference. And then, especially in Finland, Nokia was having a kind of way disproportionate success and status. So at one point, Nokia don't remember the exact numbers, but like third of the Finnish exports and substantially contributed to the gross domestic product. So if you worked in Nokia, you were treated as a hero in the grocery store. And that all must have contributed to the arrogance.
I think I was told some story like that. Even if you are the president of China Nokia at that time, that the Nokia products of India account for a significant percentage of the exports of the country. Not the Nokian product. So you are a big cheese even in those countries at that time, because they have a huge manufacturing base out for Nokia. So I guess that given that huge success, it's difficult not to feel a little bit complacent, isn't it? And then on top of it, they again to middle managed defense. They believed that they had utmost technical superiority in terms of the patents, right? That the Samsung and Apple was used at that time. So he said, no matter what happens, we will have the bottlenecks, quote unquote, but they use the patents anyway. So we'll be able to catch up fairly quickly. So I think all of those perceptions contributed to that sense of invincibility.
Yeah, and it's really this kind of natural that they had built this fantastic technology and they had given like 1 billion phones to the world. Like one 1/5 of the world population was using Nokia phone. They had done that in 10 years. So I think that's like almost like a miracle, like how fast they were able to grow, and natural that they got a bit overconfident or arrogant after that. But I think the lesson we can learn from that is that even if we have like successful years as innovators, we should remain curious and keep learning. But it's easy to just settle in your own success.
That's a mention to remain humble. It's just said and done.
Absolutely. And Satya Nadella's things, be a learn-it-all, not a know-it-all, is very relevant. A couple of just quotes here. This is from the CEO who downplayed Android strategy publicly in 2008, November 2008. We have had that platform and applications for 10 years, he said. Definitely we're ahead. Likewise, an EVP stated publicly that the iPhone is an interesting product, but it is lacking a few essential features such as 3G, which would enable fast data connections. So I think it's such an important point to actually go, you as an organization, you as a leader, where are you not being humble? Where are you saying these things about some competitor? And this is the thing about disruptive innovation. It always appears as a lesser product, and then they build up capability. We see this a lot. Say, for example, a bank often relies on regulation to protect it, to insulate it from the outside world. But there's huge changes coming, and they'll dismiss those changes and dismiss the opportunity to build capabilities for the future.
I've also had very similar conversations about the role of regulation. So it's always easy to find some dimension where you're better than the other one. As a teenager, I used to say that I'm stronger than Wayne Gretzky, the ice hockey player, and more flexible than Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I think we all do that. But in Nokia case, the top management was also in huge dilemma, so they had to keep speaking confidently to investors. But when they did that, they also, as a side effect, created arrogance and lack of humility in the organization. And we even have a counterfactual. So when Nokia replaced the CEO in 2010 and he gave a new speech in early 2011, he said that our products are bad, we are far behind from competition, and the immediate stock market reaction was very negative, and all the orders were cancelled by all the customers. So yeah, that faced the reality, but it also didn't work.
There's a quote I have to finish, but I'd love your finale, your final words on this paper. And we're going to come back because there's an interesting thing many of our audience won't know is that Nokia are back, everybody. They've reinvented themselves, and they used all the lessons from this paper to actually drive that reinvention. It was the fuel for that reinvention. But I love this quote, and it was towards the end of the paper. You said, top managers were not just passive recipients of information. They actively shaped what would be communicated to them by influencing their subordinates' emotions, both directly through their directives and indirectly through structural choices. This suggests that one predictor of the accuracy of top managers' mental models could be their ability to influence the quality of their interaction with middle managers by managing their own and middle managers' emotions. This goes to your point about you have to be able to control your emotions. In a way, then you need to be a corporate athlete. You need to be able to look after your stress levels so you don't bring them to the organization, like you said, Timo, where they're not looking and going, what kind of mood is Aidan in today? And as a result, behaving appropriately towards my emotions, where I'll direct almost like an orchestra the emotions of an organization, which is a terrible place to be in. I just thought that was a key point because that applies to everything. That applies to being in a family, in a relationship, in an organization, no matter where you are. But I'd love your final thoughts, each gentleman, on this paper before we move on to the next paper.
My final thought is that it allows us to really go deep into how paying attention to emotions or not paying attention to emotions and how you regulate emotions can have significant consequences for the welfare organization. Once I did research emotion even 30 years ago, senior executives always challenged me. He said, Professor Kui, how much money will we lost if we didn't pay attention to emotion. And I was little bit always little dumbfounded. It's almost like how much the question that you can ask like the same question about R&D, right? How much question we lost? Have you quantified it? And the case of Nokia, what allows me said, sir, it will only cost you $100 million, give or take. I don't know whether $100 million, give or take, would matter enough for you or not. My
I love it. I love it. It's a good point, though, Qui. It's very hard to quantify this, but you can feel it, and there's a different energy in an organization like that. Timo, what are your closing thoughts?
When we make strategy, we are super comprehensive about validating our assumptions. But then this paper shows that when we do the implementation of the strategy, we make overly simplistic assumptions about how people in the organization feel and behave. And therefore, all the work that went on checking the external assumptions is irrelevant, because the bigger assumptions are the emotions that we completely ignore.
Beautiful. I think we've done a good job.
Yeah, I think, congratulations, Aidan. You really read our papers. Sound great. Eric, I think you are the most careful reader I have ever come across.
Oh, you have no idea, man. The rabbit holes I go down, because I don't just read the paper, then I start Googling and reading paper. Anyway, I'll finish this episode because I know you guys need to head off. It's been an absolute pleasure, though. Authors of this paper on Nokia, which is an absolute brilliant read, and I really hope people do take time to read it. Get in touch if you want a copy of that. The guys have kindly let me share that to people who really deal with strategy and change inside organizations, because they really want to make a big difference. Qui Hui and Timo Vuori, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Aidan.
Thank you, Aidan.
Thanks as always to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at kyndryl.com.